Okay, welcome everyone. We're so glad you could be here with us today to join us for this presentation. The title of today's History Day support session is Keeping Track of Your Research, Note-Taking, and the Bibliography. This session is designed for students, so we are welcoming student participation, but teachers are definitely welcome to stick around and see what we're doing. We just ask that everyone keep your microphones on mute unless we ask you to unmute to answer a question. We'll try to answer some of your questions in the chat as we go, but if you have something that's sort of off topic or really related to your topic, we ask that you save it till the end. So just write down your question when you think of it, and then definitely bring it up later because we'll have plenty of time at the end of this to answer all questions that you might have. We just ask that you keep everything in the chat respectful. We'll have students of all different ages joining us. Some of them have done History Day before and some have not. So it's important that everyone feels welcome to ask their questions and to contribute to the discussion. So I thank you in advance for being respectful participants. So my name is Miss Leah and I'm here today with Miss Grace, and we both work for Maryland Humanities, and we work on the state level Maryland History Day contest. And you might have seen us in your classrooms. We go to help out all the time. We talk to teachers. And in this session, we are going to start out by talking about how to take notes for your History Day project. And then we'll talk about how to do the annotated bibliography the way NHD suggests. And then, as I said before, we will leave a good amount of time at the end for questions. All right, so I'm going to jump right in and I'm going to start us off talking about note-taking. Okay, so before we start talking about note-taking, me and Grace have our own topic for our project, just so that we can get some examples together and really dig in and show you some real examples. So our topic today, go ahead and type it in the chat if you know this guy's name. Anybody? You got it, Olive? Yep, good job. Thanks, guys. Yes, so this is Frederick Douglass. And we like to talk about Frederick Douglass around the topic, around the theme of communication. So go ahead and type in the chat how you think Frederick Douglass connects to that theme of communication. What does Frederick Douglass have to do with communication? Good. All right. Good, Emmanuel. Good, Anya. So excellent. He founded a newspaper, which you can see right behind him. It was called the North Star. And good, Anya, Dorian, and Jack all said that he wrote speeches. Yes, he was a great orator. And you are correct. He was anti-slavery. So everything he did was just pushing this abolitionist message and trying to get people to understand why there shouldn't be slavery. So here's what I've got about Frederick Douglass. Communicated his abolitionist stance through his autobiography, speeches, letters, and newspaper. Okay, so we're going to dig in a little bit and take some notes about Frederick Douglass today. So luckily, we have an inquiry kit about Frederick Douglass on the thinkport.org website. So I'm going to show you that for just a second. And I've already got it open in another tab here. Can everyone see that? Okay, so this website is thinkport.org. So you can find this on your own if you go to thinkport.org/TPS. And there, if you click on inquiry kits, you'll find a number of different primary source sets about different topics in history. And this is a great place to kickstart your History Day research, because when I scroll down, you'll see we've got 5 primary sources all picked out for you and 1 secondary source. So this is a great resource for you. It's separated by time period. So if you look through and find the time period that you're doing, you might see if we have an inquiry kit on your topic. All right, so I'm going to go back to my slideshow for just a second. So my tips about taking notes are that we're always going to start our research with a research question. So before we take any notes, before we even start reading, we need to have a research question to guide us. All right. So this is going to be the question that your whole project is going to help to answer. Think about what you want to learn and how your topic intersects with that, that theme of communication. So the research question that I have, the main research question about Frederick Douglass is, how did Frederick Douglass communicate his abolitionist message through his writing? Okay, so that's a really big question, and there are a lot of ways to answer this, but it's a good place to start because we've got the topic, Frederick Douglass, we've got the theme, communication, and we've got that he's giving an abolitionist message. Okay, so we're weaving all those parts of it together and putting it in question form. A research question is something that's sort of open-ended. It's not something that you can answer with just one sentence or one word or phrase. It's something that takes a lot of research. It's something that you need to find a lot of evidence for to back up. Okay, and then I've got a few sub-questions, and these questions are going to help me to answer that bigger question. So I've got things like, how did he use his personal history to communicate his abolitionist message? What actions did he call on people to take? What arguments did he make for abolition, whether they were philosophical arguments or emotional arguments? And what impact did he have? So all of these smaller questions are going to help me answer that bigger question. And you might come up with more and more small questions as you go, as long as they can tie back to this main question. Okay? And the next big thing that I want you to remember, first is always start with a research question. Next is only take notes on information that helps you answer your research questions. Okay, I know that's bold. It's a bold statement, but you're going to read a lot of information that you don't really need in your project, right? You only want to take away the most important stuff that really applies to what you are trying to figure out. Okay, so that's step one. The next thing I want you to sort of have in your mind is this overview of your whole project. I want you to have this outline in your mind. Raise your hand if you've seen this graphic organizer before. No one? Okay, not yet, not yet. You might see it later. So this graphic organizer is to help you think about how you're going to build out these different sections of your project. So obviously everyone's going to have a title, everyone's going to have a thesis statement, and the main focus of your project is going to be this main event in the middle. So for my topic, this is where I'm going to put everything that I find about Frederick Douglass as a writer and Frederick Douglass communicating a message about abolition. All right, but there are some other supporting elements to the story. All right, not just the main event. We also want to look back in time and we want to look forward in time. So we've got the background information. This is the historical context. What did the country look like at that time? In our case with Frederick Douglass, we can think about, what did the lives of the Black population look like? Were there other Black writers at that time? What did the abolitionist movement look like? That's going to help us set the context for writing about Frederick Douglass. The buildup is, the steps leading up to the main event. It's a little bit closer to that main topic, though. It'll be a little bit more specific to Frederick Douglass. And then on the other side, ahead in time of our main event, we've got the short-term impact and the historical significance, which we can also think of as being the long-term impact. How do we still see these themes in the present day? So, as you're taking notes, as you're doing this research, you also want to think about which section of the project will this note help me support. All right, so that's Thing number 2 that I want you to have in mind. Thing number 1, research question. Thing number 2, where will it go in my project? Next, before we start practicing, I just have some other tips for you. And the main tip, that thing number 3 to remember, is just be organized, because that's really going to help you later. Use a project folder, either on Google Drive or on your computer, to store all files related to your project, including your notes. Be sure to include the name of the source and the page numbers for the notes you make so that you can go back to that source again and read more. Label your notes. Again, you're going to be thinking about how that source fits into your project, pull out any main ideas. And then the next thing to think about, again, when we're thinking about note taking, we're also thinking about how we can avoid plagiarism. We want to make sure that the words in our project are our own unless we quote it directly. So most of your notes will be paraphrased so that you don't get confused. You're going to write things in your own words. You're going to shrink them down. You're not going to paraphrase everything word for word. You're going to summarize a bit and make it shorter, make it easier. But if you think a line from a primary source will be useful in helping you make your point, you can include it in your notes, but be sure to put the whole thing in quotes so you know where it came from. So you know that it wasn't your words, you know that it's someone else's. And as for secondary sources, you don't need to do any quotes from secondary sources. NHD is recommending against it because we want you to tell the story. Okay, and finally, just something to remember, your teachers, judges, and other readers won't see your notes. So it's really up to you how you organize them. You can do whatever makes the most sense to you, but make sure they are useful to you. Okay, so that's my main advice. So at this point, I want to do a little bit of practice. So I'm going to go back to this inquiry kit that we looked at. And I want to take notes on the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, which is Frederick Douglass's autobiography. So I'm just going to click on this to open it in a new tab. And I want to take notes in a Google Doc. But before we do that, let's just take a look at this source. So first of all, who wrote it? Write it in the chat. Who wrote this piece? There was a hint in the comment that I made about it. It is an autobiography. Good, Shaylee. Yeah, you got it. So we know this was written by Frederick Douglass. And we see that down here with contributor names. And we also see William Lloyd Garrison. And I'm not sure what he did. He might have written an introduction to it. He was another abolitionist. And next question, what year was this written? See if you can find it. What year was this written? Good, Alexis. All right, excellent. You found it down here in created, published. Was this before or after the end of slavery? Yeah, you're right, Jack. All right, excellent. Yeah, so slavery was still going on at this time. And this formerly enslaved man got his autobiography published. Excellent. And who was this published by? See if you can find it. Who was this published by? All right, good, Kelstein. Yes. Thanks, Elizabeth. Yep, the Anti-Slavery Office. Excellent. So that shows us who was willing to publish work by Frederick Douglass at that time. Excellent. Okay. So now I'm going to open a Google Doc, and I've actually got my Google Drive ready to go right here. I'm going to press new Google Doc so I can start taking my notes. And I'm going to title it Frederick Douglass. Oops. Frederick Douglass Project Notes. And what I'm going to do in this document is I'm going to create a table. So I'm going to click Insert, Table. I want 3 columns across and just a lot of them, a lot of rows going down. Doesn't matter how many because we can always add more. And sorry, I've got to move my Zoom stuff. And I'm going to make the first column and the last column a little bit smaller. My first column is going to be for sources. My second column is going to be information. I'm going to make this bold as well. And my third column is going to be section or topic. I'll make this bold as well. So for source, let's go back to the title here. Our source was Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. So I'm going to go ahead and type this in. Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a link here so I can always come back to it. And how I'm going to do that is I am going to copy this link address. And then I'm going to come over here. I'm going to highlight this text. I'm going to right click on it. I'm going to click on the link. And then I'm going to paste that web address that I just copied and apply. And now I can always link back to that source so I won't lose it again. I can always go right back to it. And now let's take some notes. So the first step in note taking is reading. So now we got to do some reading. So I'm going to read some of this out loud to you, and then I'd like you to tell me what you're thinking about it. What are you getting from it? Okay. So this is Frederick Douglass speaking. He says, I was now about 12 years old, and the thought of being a slave for life began to bear heavily upon my heart. Just about this time, I got hold of a book entitled The Columbian Orator. The Columbian Orator was a sort of textbook for students 200 years ago, and it had political speeches and essays so that young students could learn about the government, about the values of the country, and things like that. All right. Every opportunity I got, I used to read this book. Among much of other interesting matter, I found in it a dialogue between a master and his slave. The slave was represented as having run away from his master 3 times. The dialogue represented the conversation which took place between them when the slave was retaken the 3rd time. In this dialogue, the whole argument in behalf of slavery was brought forward by the master, all of which was disposed of by the slave. So the slave he brushed it off. He was like, your arguments are not correct, sir. The slave was made to say some very smart as well as impressive things in reply to his master, things which had the desired though unexpected effect, for the conversation resulted in the voluntary emancipation of the slave on the part of the master. What does that last part of the sentence mean? The voluntary emancipation of the slave on the part of the master. Write in the chat what you think that means. Good, you're right, Dorian. Yeah, he let him go. Yep, you're right, Jack. The enslaved man convinced the master of his point of view, and the master let him go. Okay, so what do we learn from this passage? What do we learn about Frederick Douglass from this passage? I know it's mostly about something he read, but what do we learn about him? That he likes to learn. Yes, he's hungry for knowledge. All right, so we're learning a little bit about Frederick Douglass's character here. So I'm going to write some of that. I love that. Likes to learn. Okay, but we need to know who. So since we're writing notes, remember, we don't need to write in complete sentences. We can abbreviate if we want to. So from now on, Frederick Douglass is going to be FD for me. What else do we learn about him? Just like really basic parts of his life. He could read. Good. That's important. Do you think that many young enslaved children could read back then? No, you're right. So even knowing that is really important. Yeah. Could read as a child. Okay, good. What other really basic thing do we learn about his life from this? Oh, good, Shaylee. Yes. All right. Okay. What happened to the slave might have inspired him or given him hope. When he was younger, he was afraid of becoming a slave and looked to books. He was afraid of being a slave. All right, excellent. So first of all, we know that he was enslaved, right? So that is going to be really important as well. Obviously, you know, all of us know that, but that's going to really shape our project. And I will say something. So I usually tell you guys not to go too much into historical figures' childhoods. But in this case, this is one of the exceptions because it is really important to know that he was enslaved as a child, that he knew how to read, because all of that is helping to shape him as a writer and as an abolitionist. So if you're doing like Franklin Delano Roosevelt or Alexander Graham Bell or other people like that, we don't usually need to know about their childhood unless it really makes an impact on the main event. Okay. So we learn a lot about him. I want to go back to this graphic organizer that I showed you before. So remember this graphic organizer where we talked about the different sections of the project. So what sections of the project do you think this information fits into? Go ahead and type in the chat what you think. Background. Good. Excellent. Okay. So I'm going to say not exactly historical context, but more like the build up. It's going to look a little bit different depending on what kind of project you're doing. But for historical context, we're going to think broader. We're going to think about the whole country. For build up to the main event, or it sometimes gets called background. You guys are right. We're going to focus on Frederick Douglass and his life. Okay, so good. Build up or background. So there we go. We've got a little bit of information. I'm also going to put a page number in here so that we always know what page it is. And it is page 39. I'm going to use the page that is in the book, not the image number up here. And you see it up there too, because the page number is what would actually go into our footnotes if you're writing a paper, or into your bibliography if you are just using a few pages of something. So page 39. Okay, so this is the first method that I'm showing you how to take notes. And this is a really great method. If you wanted to, you could put each of these into different rows if you had something really different to say. And like I said, you could use a direct quote as well. So I'm just going to show you one really quickly. So there was one quote that I really liked. So the more he reads, the angrier he gets. And so he says here, the more I read, the more I was led to abhor and detest my enslavers. So both of those words, abhor and detest, both mean hate. So it just showed that the more educated he got, the more enlightened he got about his situation, the more angry he got, and the more he wanted to change things. And that really feeds into his writing as well. You know, he's getting all these ideas from writing, and he himself becomes a writer. So these are really events that shaped his life and that shaped his writing. So if I wanted to, I could say, all right, this is from the same source as above, and I could type that quote right in here. The more I read, I'm not going to finish typing it right now, but I would type the whole thing out so I could remember it and make sure it's in quotation marks so that you know that you didn't write it yourself. All right. Okay, so I'm actually going to turn it over to Grace now because that went by a lot quicker than I thought it would. So I'm going to stop sharing here. And Grace, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Leah. Yeah, so Leah kind of walked us through, right, how to take some notes, how to think critically about when we're reading sources. And now I'm going to share how we keep track of those things. So how we take that information we've gathered and then kind of throughout our projects, and especially at the end of our projects, put together this kind of annotated bibliography. Annotated bibliography, it's a big thing that we get a lot of questions about for History Day. I think it can sometimes feel a little overwhelming or a little confusing. So it is definitely always good to go over. I pressed the wrong button. Okay, now I'm going to press the right button. I'm going to press present. So the annotated bibliography is basically made up of two main parts. It is a collection of both citations and annotations. So citations are what identify and document a source. They help give credit for where you found information, and they can help others find that information later too. And then annotations give a little bit of more detail about the source and its connection to your project in particular. So kind of like to think about these citations and these annotations working together to make up your annotated bibliography and kind of provide credit to where you got your research and kind of provide a document about kind of a documentation of what research you did and the research skills you developed in your project. So when I think about the annotated bibliography, one of the things I like to think about is how it breaks down into two sections. We really break it into both primary sources and secondary sources. So primary sources, any guesses about which one of these piles is primary sources and which one is secondary sources in the chat? Is it primary sources on the left or on the right? I like to think of primary, exactly, yep, they're on the left. You guys have got it, right? Primary sources are those kind of building blocks of history. So they're those pieces from the time that we're talking about. So those are really important to our annotated bibliography, and they'll go in the first section of our bibliography. So when I'm thinking about sources and I'm thinking about creating citations, citations can kind of feel complicated when you look at them all together, but they kind of start from these really basic pieces, the things that you're looking for in a source. So when I'm looking at a source, the things I want to look for my citation are the author of the source, the title of the source, who published it. That's particularly relevant for books, and where the source can be accessed. So if I found it online or if I found it in a certain collection, some of that is going to be useful as well to be included. So this is a great example, right? So this is the piece of the primary source that Leah was just looking at us with this narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. So the author, I think, is pretty clear to us. That's Frederick Douglass is the person who is the author, right? So we can see where that's highlighted. It says written by himself. We know it was written by Frederick Douglass, but that's kind of an example of sometimes it can be a little tricky to pull it into a little tricky to figure out where the author's listed and things like that. But there's normally really helpful details. And so then in red, what we've got highlighted is the title. That's another one that feels pretty obvious, right? We're seeing that title in the very beginning of the book, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. And so one of the things too that can be particularly useful is this is like in the first couple of pages of a book. Generally in the first couple of pages of a book, you're going to be able to find all this information. So if you find the book online or you have a copy of it, you can look in those first couple of pages. And then this is where it can get a little bit more tricky in the citation. I think this is the part that can be kind of overwhelming. And that's that kind of, this is the kind of information that is about publications. So first we want to be able to say where it was published. And just a quick note, I'm using Chicago style citations right now. That's what National History Day really recommends. But if you use MLA in your classroom or your teacher prefers a different kind of citation, that's totally fine. And this information is still applicable. All right, so here's where we can see Boston, right? When it says Boston and this information about publishing, it means that this book was first printed and published in Boston. So I'm going to put that into my citation, and then I'm going to look for who published it. Just like Leah was saying, right? It was published at the Anti-Slavery Office, and it was published in 1849. So a lot of those things are kind of overlapping, right? We might have learned some of this in our note-taking process, but we're going to revisit it when we're going to look more closely at building our citations. And then just kind of briefly too, if you'd found this, right, we looked at this online from the Library of Congress. Underneath the pictures, you'll see information about the item, and that's going to happen a lot on Google Books, or on different National Archives, for example. Different websites will have different places where they keep information about the item. So here we can see again, right, there's the author, the title, the place and the publication, and then the date it was published. So a lot of that information is being made available to us in a lot of different spaces. So I want to go, I'm going to stop sharing and switch over to a different screen, and we're going to look really quickly at this other resource in the ThinkPort kits, because I think it's kind of a funky one to, oh, you know what, I'm realizing I was already in my Google Drive. Okay, so I'm going to escape real quick, exit full screen for a second here, and go over to our ThinkPort inquiry kit. And so let's look at this one right here. This source right here is a photograph. It's a photograph of a mural. So citing a photograph is really similar to citing a book. It's a little bit different, but I'm going to show you where we can find that similar kind of information, right? So we're seeing the title right away. That's like pretty basic. One of the things that can be nice to be able to include in this is the URL, because it is an online source. So I might be able to copy this information. And I'm finding the contributor. So here the contributor is still that kind of author creator role. So Carol Highsmith is the photographer, and we're going to keep her in that as well. And then there's kind of a big date range. So I can't give a specific date, but I can put the range of dates that this photo might have been taken. So I'm going to go back into this presentation, and we can see how we did that, right? We see the creator, we see where the photo was taken. That's kind of that in, oh, I did the thing again. I pressed the wrong button. Look at that. So it can be kind of flexible. That kind of published information is still about place, right? Just like we said Boston for Frederick Douglass's autobiography, here we're going to say Washington, D.C., because that's where the mural is. And then we're going to put all those pieces together. We're going to lead with the photographer. I'm going to clarify that she's the photographer, that she wasn't the person who painted the mural. So that will help us be more clear in that citation. And then we can say between 1980 and 2006. And then we're going to clarify it's a photograph and provide a link for the URL, because there's an online source that we used. So then we can move on to the next part of our annotated bibliography. And this is kind of the annotation. And what an annotation is basically something, I like to think about it as a support of the citation. It just kind of clarifies the citation and what's included there. So they're really going to be 2 or 3 sentences, and they're include a lot in that 2 or 3 sentences. So they can be kind of tricky to write. But basically, it's going to be a description of what the source was, the format of the source or what it contained, and how you used it in your project. An explanation of how it was useful in shaping your understanding, and an explanation of why you categorize this source as a primary, secondary source. That's only really necessary if it's unclear or confusing. So, right, we talk a lot about in our classes and in our History Day projects about when is a primary source or when it's a secondary source. So a lot of your annotations aren't going to have to talk about that at all, but you can talk about it if it feels kind of confusing which one is which. At the end of the day, your annotation is really just providing information about your source and the research that you did with it. So these are kinds of the questions I use to break that down. One, what type of source is this? How was the source used? And how did the source help you understand the topic? And then we can use these kinds of prompts to do that kind of first stab at annotation. And that will help us get our first draft. So for our first draft, we just combine our answers from the previous questions. So for the Frederick Douglass, for the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, this is kind of the source. This is kind of the citation and annotation I would come up with, right? I'd say the source is an autobiography. I used it because it told me about Frederick Douglass's life and how he learned to read and write and how he became an abolitionist, and that's relating to me and Leah's project topic. And I'd say this source helped me understand Douglass's feelings about slavery, reading, writing, freedom, and abolition. So I'm answering those 3 questions, but maybe it's feeling a little long. Maybe it's not explaining exactly what I learned from this source. I think one of the things that can happen in annotated bibliography is we want more specificness, like more specificity in our annotation. So I want to be more specific about what I learned. So my next draft, I'm going to add that specificness. I'm going to say, I use this source to show how reading about patriotic values in the Columbian Orator helped to shape Douglass's ideas about slavery and abolition. Right, so now I've added this information about why communication was important to Frederick Douglass and why I learned that from this source, but I've gotten kind of long. It can be really easy for annotations to get long when we're writing them. So I'm going to revisit this, trim it down a little bit, and be a little bit more clear in my writing. And that's going to help me get to my final annotation, which is going to say, this autobiography of Frederick Douglass helped me understand the importance of reading and writing in Douglass's life and the role of communication in his work as an abolitionist. It gave me details about how reading about patriotic values in the Columbian Orator helped to shape Douglass's ideas about slavery and abolition. So now I've answered those questions. I've identified what kind of source we're looking at. I've added more details about what I've learned, and I've kept it to only 2 sentences. So it's gotten a little bit shorter and a little bit more concise. So this is kind of what that sample annotated bibliography could look like. We would take primary sources and secondary sources. Obviously here I'm only putting 2 sources. We'd have a little bit more, but this will kind of walk through what it'll kind of look like. You'll notice the indents that we've got on the sides, how we've broken up the sources into different pieces, and how we've separated our citations and our annotations. Great, so I want to leave time for us to ask questions. So I'm going to bump back out and stop sharing my screen and bring us all back into the group so that we can ask questions. And I want to open it up to you guys if you guys have any questions about anything we talked about today or anything going on in your projects. A question that we get a lot that maybe I'll talk about right now before it even gets spread up is about how many sources you need for your History Day project. And one of the things is that's really flexible. So that's almost a question that we don't really have an answer to. There's no magic number of sources. You might have some classroom like source numbers you need to meet, but for the History Day project itself, it's really going to depend on your research. So some projects you might need more sources for, some projects you're going to need fewer sources. But that's really a flexible number that's going to be determined by you during your research process. But that's one I always like to get out of the way because it's a big question that we get a lot about annotated bibliographies. So a question I got in the chat is it okay to make our annotated bibliography a slideshow? So for most projects, your annotated bibliography is going to be a separate like Word document, or a Google Drive document that you'll present with your project. And so we tend not to use that Google slide format. That was just for the sake of showing us today. It's really going to be a more traditional like Word document format, 8.5 by 11 kind of classic.